completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online, Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Edinburgh reforms. Today, the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt will be announcing Brexit-inspired reforms to financial services, first dreamed up under the Truss administration. Today, we're asking, is Rishi Sunak going to be radical after all? That after the headlines.
Good morning, it's 9:31. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. The Chancellor has announced plans to overhaul the British financial sector by pledging to review, repeal and replace hundreds of pages of EU regulations. Dubbed the Edinburgh Reforms, Jeremy Hunt says Brexit has provided a golden opportunity to reshape the rules governing the financial sector. More than 30 regulatory changes have been unveiled, including reversing some measures introduced following the 2008 financial crash. The government hopes the plans will help end the UK's sluggish record on growth. Thousands of Royal Mail workers are expected to protest in Westminster later in an ongoing row over pay and conditions. Members of the Communication Workers Union will walk out again on Sunday with further action planned throughout the month, including on Christmas Eve. Royal Mail warns the action will affect deliveries across the UK. Customers are being advised to post Christmas mail earlier than usual this year. Britain will work with Italy and Japan to develop a next-generation fighter jet known as the Tempest. It's designed to replace the Typhoon and is expected to take to the skies by 2035. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak says the partnership will ensure the UK and its allies are outpacing and outmanoeuvring those who seek to do us harm. And a Tory MP is planning to propose a law that could strip the Duke and Duchess of Sussex of their royal titles. Isle of Wight MP and Government Minister Bob Seeley says there's a political issue with Harry's comments. That's after he quit as a senior royal 2 years ago. It comes as the first 3 episodes of their controversial new Netflix documentary were released yesterday, in which Prince Harry accuses the royal family of having a huge level of unconscious bias. TV online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to the briefing with Tom.
Good morning, it's 9:33 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Well, today, Chancellor Jeremy Hunt is set to launch major reforms to the United Kingdom's financial services sector, with plans to rip up red tape and replace many EU regulations. Branded as the Edinburgh Reforms, they'll be announced in the Scottish capital, the second largest financial centre in the United Kingdom. In truth, these are a rebranded version of what the Truss administration was describing as the Big Bang 2.0. So might Rishi Sunak be more radical than we expected after all? Elsewhere this week, the MP Julian Knight has accused the Tory party of denying his right to a fair hearing after being suspended over sexual assault allegations. Along with the suspension of the MP Conor McGinn from the Labour Party, this now takes the total number of independent MPs to 15, a larger group than the Liberal Democrats. Well, let's discuss these stories now with the former government speechwriter and advisor to Prime Minister Liz Truss, Asa Bennett. And Asa,
good morning.
First of all, listening to what we're expecting Jeremy Hunt to be saying in Edinburgh later today, have we been perhaps too harsh upon Rishi Sunak over the last few weeks? Is he not this sort of carefully, slowly sort of figure that he's been painted as? Does he actually have a bit of reforming zeal, a bit of a Trussian quality, perhaps?
Well, look, they're both colleagues, and it's great to see that Rishi is unleashing his inner radical, as we see that he's carrying on the work that Liz was championing a government of seizing our post-Brexit freedoms and making sure the city can be at its most competitive and at its best. And if I just pick one of the reforms, for example, this thing called Solvency II, the capital requirements, fantastically technical, I know, but I'm merely just going to say this. It's things that the insurers were saying were stopping them investing tens of billions of pounds in British infrastructure. And that's just what we need to get Britain building, growing and, getting the growth we really want to see in the economy.
It's interesting, though, looking at the whole sort of supply-side reform agenda that the Truss administration really was wanting to get to. Of course, we never got to the announcement of so many of these individual pieces of supply-side reform that the Truss administration was planning. Is it your view that perhaps the Hunt Chancellery or indeed the Sunak administration might be picking up some of these bits that were being worked on for so long behind the scenes under the last administration?
Yes, I'd like to think that Rishi is picking up where Liz left off, in that they both would be united in agreeing that there needs to be growth, and obviously we've seen Rishi had to come in to stabilise the markets, reassure people that there was that long-term plan in place, and then as a result, there are things that have been ditched from the Truss administration, like investment zones. But then Michael Gove's made clear he's effectively rebranding them and pursuing by different means the same sort of ends. And as we see that, when you're coming out of the sort of pandemic and the after effects of Putin's war, you do need to make sure there's jobs being created, that there are the industries of the future there. And this is the sort of stuff we're seeing today that will ensure that the city can be right there at the cutting edge.
And yet there is, of course, the element of corporation tax rising when most other countries, most of our competitors are looking at reducing their tax burdens. Our tax burden has risen to the highest it has ever been. Similarly, you mentioned things like investment zones, perhaps planning liberalisation that was expected under Liz Truss. These things have been ditched. That's going to knock growth.
Of course, the government has made clear they see this as anti-growth. It's a challenge for growth that will constrain it. So they've been clear in those terms. But of course, I think the logic in their view for the Sunak administration is that if they tighten the belts now, then they can go for gold in the years to come, as it were. Obviously, the Truss administration would have pursued it in that sense in a different way. But what we're seeing now, at least, is, yes, it is regrettable that you're now seeing the highest taxes since the war. But then they will want to try and balance the books so they can pay for it later. They can start to sort of give tax cuts later down the line.
It's a really, really fascinating situation. But looking at the wider system of sort of party management, we have heard from both parties this week stories of whips being suspended. And I was interested to look at what Julian Knight said yesterday about this sort of suspension of the whip without the process happening first. Sort of, we would suspect perhaps an innocent until proven guilty affair, and yet it does seem that sort of we've got the opposite in this case. So
I think what we've got is both parties have moved towards a model where they suspend while they investigate, because they want to show that they get it, they're acting decisively in both cases. And, this is... it's interesting, obviously, it's worth mentioning that Colin McGinn, around the same sort of time, was, suspended by Labour, because this is not an issue that's exclusive to one party. It is a challenge for the system to try and work out how, you deal with allegations of misconduct in this way. And you have to strike that really tricky balance of acting decisively, having teeth, and ensuring that those who really deserve it and are found to deserve it then face justice.
Interestingly, though, if we look back to October of this year, the MP Conor Burns had a similar suspension after some sort of allegation that was found to then be unfounded. He lost his job as a minister as a result of that. Is that process particularly fair, or is it too overzealous?
Well, I think at that point, the thinking that there was definitely a quick decision that was taken. Of course, now the administration has changed. So in terms of, where Conor then takes his complaints for remediation, of course, it's a different set of personalities.
Yeah, really, really interesting stuff there, and no doubt more to come out over these two suspensions this week, one Labour and one Conservative MP. Asa Bennett, for now, thank you so much for joining us on The Briefing. Next today, as the winter of strikes begins today, with the postal workers at Royal Mail striking over pay and conditions. The walkouts involving 115,000 workers will hit deliveries across the United Kingdom. This is one of the many strikes due to occur in the lead up to Christmas, with rail, nurses, ambulance workers and firemen, to name but a few, who'll be striking in the next few weeks. Well, is Christmas going to be cancelled? That is a big question that we will need to be discussing as we talk through these big issues. I'm delighted to say that we can talk through some of these issues in just a moment's time. But if we go next to talking a little bit about how this is going to affect us as a country, Asa Bennett is still with me while we wait for our next guest as well. Some little technical difficulties here, but strikes seem to be something that have become so common in our political parlance. Are we going back to the 1970s?
It's really almost feels like that, given the militant unions there presenting us with this advent calendar of industrial action. You know, open the door and then there's someone else walking out and not turning up for work. And I think that's why, just as Liz was doing in government, it's welcome that Rishi is trying to apply that firm smack of government in response, because people want to see strength.
But we haven't heard the detail here. We haven't heard the detail of these proposed pieces of legislation that the government talks about in very vague terms.
Yes, the minimum the minimum service levels legislation. Well, what we know is that there are similar measures in place in Belgium, Spain, France, across Europe. It's not controversial. Of course, for the unions it is, because then it's really challenging them. I think the devil, of course, will be in the detail. We know from, I think it was the Eye there, that there's analysis from the Department of Transport that shows it may well encourage unions to strike more, and that in the process of having such legislation in place, if they strike and you end up having to fire lots of employees for doing so, or not sort of helping maintain the services, maybe the services will suffer as a result. But the thing is, basically, it's calling their bluff.
And I suppose the big thing is we're not going to see any legislation this side of Christmas. Let's bring in now Suzanne Evans, the political commentator. Suzanne, is Christmas going to be cancelled?
Well, it's not going to be cancelled, obviously. Nobody can cancel Christmas, but I think it's going to be very difficult for some people. We have so many strikes across the board. We've had the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, this morning, warning that people who are going on holiday are probably going to experience delays at the border because of the 8 days of strikes that are going to be happening by the Border Force staff for the rest of this month. And then, of course, Christmas cards are going to be delayed. Anyone travelling for Christmas parties is going to be struggling as a result of the rail and other transport strikes. So it's not looking very bright. Of course, it won't be cancelled, but it's not going to be easy for a lot of people.
We're looking at what can be actually done to deal with this situation. Should we be planning to sort of scale back in terms of how we interact, what family we see, or are there political solutions that could be delivered this side of Christmas to try and make things go a little bit more smoothly?
Well, it's quite interesting. We've had the heads of the trade unions, Unison and the TUC this morning, saying that they feel that the government is refusing to negotiate with union leaders over pay. They're saying that ministers are agreeing to meetings, but when it comes to the bottom line argument about what pay rises they're going to get, it's not just happening. So they're accusing them of stonewalling negotiations, really. So I think we're at a bit of an impasse here. And it's a difficult, interesting question that you ask. Should we scale back our Christmases, or is that almost, in a sense, giving into what some people might say is the ransom of the unions? I think the unions think they have a big amount of public support. I'm not convinced, to be honest, and I think support for these strikes is waning. I think it's increasingly becoming seen as a way for unions, who of course are mostly left-wing, to try and bring down a conservative so-called right-wing government. And I think there is less public support, is just my sense, than perhaps the unions think. I think a lot of people also who are not getting huge inflation-matching pay rises are feeling quite angry that their basic services are being lost when they're not getting pay rises, anything like that. I mean, just to take one example, Royal Mail, they have been offered a 9% pay rise, which isn't quite matching inflation, but it's not bad, and it's a lot more than a lot of other people, other workers will be getting. So I'm not entirely sure that the striking workers have the support that they think they have.
Yes, it's interesting. The longer this goes on, the more complicated it may well get in terms of public opinion. I suppose it does raise the question, to what extent is this political rather than just about the welfare of those who are in these unionised industries? I suppose it will be one to watch very, very carefully, particularly tracking that public opinion as these weeks go on. But for now, Suzanne Evans, thank you so much for joining us this morning on The Briefing. Really pivotal questions to answer there. Next now, back in 2020, the MP John Penrose was commissioned by then-Chancellor Rishi Sunak to write an independent report on how the United Kingdom's approach to competition and consumer issues could be boosted following Brexit. It resulted in a host of policy proposals for the government to implement. But 18 months on, only half of these ideas have either been done or committed to so far. After the reforming zeal of the Truss administration, has this new government come to a juddering halt when it comes to supply-side reform? Is that reforming zeal of the Brexit revolution over? Or could this government take on this challenge after all? Well, I'm delighted to be able to speak now to John Penrose, the MP for Weston-super-Mare, who has, of course, carried out this report back in 2020. You've done an update now. You're calling it Unfinished Revolution, because so many of these recommendations haven't been taken on. What's your assessment in terms of whether or not the government is willing to look at doing perhaps some of the harder kind of reform work to get this country moving?
Well, Tom, absolutely right. It is a crucial question. And I think the auguries are good, the signs are good, because it was, as you said in your introduction, it was Rishi Sunak who asked me to do the original report when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer. Now he's in number 10 Downing Street. He ought to be perfectly positioned to take the rest of it forward. So I have my fingers firmly crossed. But the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. It's a question of what he's going to do. You know, we've had the first 6 weeks or so, and he's managed to steady the ship. That's great. Now's the time to get radical. Now's the time to use that stability, and particularly because the supply side reforms are things that unblock the arteries of Britain's economy. They don't cost very much money. They are, sorry about the cat, they don't cost very much money, and at the moment money is scarce, and that means that it's one of the obvious things to do.
Today, looking at the Edinburgh reforms that the Chancellor will be announcing. These are things that aren't going to cost any money at all, but could free up a lot of money to be invested in our country. Is that a sign of things to come?
Well, I hope so, and it's a really good example of precisely the kind of reform that we need to have. So I'm really pleased to see it. I mean, obviously, the devil will be in the detail. We'll have to make sure that it pays off. But the good thing about it is, if that is the first of many, then that's exactly what we want to see. But we need to see those Edinburgh reforms happening not just in the financial services sector, but in dozens of other sectors across the rest of our country too, whatever the versions are for energy or for water or for anything else. We've got to see all those equivalents happening as well. And that's what we need to see being rolled out in different sectors over the course of the next few months.
And a number of other sectors. These are Brexit-inspired liberalisations. These are things we can do because we've left the auspices of the rules of the European Union. But there are some things that we can do that were nothing to do with the European Union, particularly when it comes to our planning framework here in the United Kingdom. And I understand you've got an amendment to the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill that's all about making it easier to sort of densify our cities.
So Michael Gove has done some really good stuff so far. There's a lot of good things in the Levelling Up bill to do with not just getting rid of some planning targets, but also making it easier for people to cooperate with their neighbours and come up with something called street votes. It basically means you can add an extra story or two onto your house if all your neighbours sort of sign up to it and you all reckon that you can do the same changes and you all want to do add those extra stories. But what I'm suggesting is a bigger version of that to say, look, if we can make it easier for everybody who lives in a town who owns a home to add extra height up to sort of 3 or 4 stories, maybe that's all. It's the equivalent of a townhouse, in other words. You can end up with really beautiful towns and cities right the way across the country. You can add a huge amount of extra housing space in our country. And that will mean that not only do existing homeowners get a benefit of a more valuable home, but also as that extra space gets built, it should mean that housing gets an awful lot cheaper, either to rent or to buy, for anybody under 40. And at the moment, they're the ones who are really struggling to afford homes. So this is aiming to unblock that, to free it up, to let that happen. And if we can make those changes now, then it could make a huge difference to the affordability of housing right the way across the country for generation rent.
It is remarkable sort of how much space there is above our heads rather than spreading out into perhaps those counties that perhaps don't want to see greenfields built over. I believe I'm right in saying that if London had the same sort of density as Paris, if we had sort of, townhouses that were 4 to 6 stories tall rather than 1 to 2 stories tall, we'd be able to fit double the population in. How likely do you think it is that the government is going to take you up on this particular amendment?
Well, they've already accepted the basic idea because they've already agreed to this thing I was mentioning before called street votes, which is a kind of a mini version of what I'm suggesting. So the principle's already in the bill. And so what I'm suggesting to Michael Gove and to other colleagues is, look, if we think this is a good idea, why not go a bit further? Why not sort of add a bit of chocolate on top and give everyone a bit of a bonus at the same time?
Well, we'll follow the progress of that amendment very, very closely. But for now, John Penrose, thank you so much for joining us here on The Briefing this morning. Really, really interesting stuff there. Just finally today, research shows that more than 3 million low-income households can't afford to heat their homes. That's despite the tens of billions being spent on the energy price guarantee. The UK Health Security Agency has issued a cold weather alert recommending that vulnerable people warm their homes to at least 18 degrees, wear extra layers and eat hot food to protect themselves from these plummeting temperatures. And charity National Energy Action says that people are facing the choice of either a huge debt or an unheated home. Well, what can be done about all of this? Joining me now is the former Chief Executive of Energy UK, Angela Knight. And Angela, first of all, is there a way for people to stay warm this winter without adding a huge amount of money onto their energy bills?
Yes, I think there's more things that can be done, actually. I mean, right now with this cold snap, of course, there's a lot of people will be entitled to an additional £25 or so. For the particular, cold weather that we've had. I don't quite know the numbers, but certainly it seems to cover this additional payment, much of the north of England and the Midlands. So there's another chunk of money for some people. I think what has happened, though, and of course, don't forget, we've had a particularly warm October and November. What has happened is that the additional assistance for energy has been coming in bits and pieces. There's so much a month, or there's a payment that comes in every quarter or whatever. And that is making it a little bit difficult for people to work out exactly how much they can get. At the same time, energy companies themselves have a responsibility. So anyone who is concerned that they can't pay their bills, they need to get in touch with their energy company, not later, but right now. The councils, some councils can help. And indeed, there's all sorts of community groups up and down the country. I'm not pretending that it's easy, but I am saying that there's quite a lot there. Some of it's a bit bitty, and some of it may have come in earlier than you expected, and it may come in an indirect payment like money that comes off your council tax or whatever. But there is quite a lot of help around this year, and particularly there is a concern but for those who, the poorer end of society and the additional help that they require.
And just quickly, how concerned should we be about the situation in France, where strikes are leading to less energy generation? It's expected that the UK may start exporting energy to the French at a time when there are shortages here anyway.
Well, I would imagine, I don't know the details of the contracts that we have on the interconnectors between the UK and France. But what is certainly the case is every country's got a force majeure. And if we can't generate enough for ourselves, we certainly can't export. You're correct to highlight France. France has had trouble all year. It's still got at least 40% of its nuclear power generators, which are the majority of their power generation, down with maintenance issues. And certainly they've got others which rely on river water, and their rivers have been low. France is the great exporter of electricity across Europe too. So there's a whole big piece there which is problematic. But what we do have is we've still got some of our old coal-fired power stations around, 2 or 3, and we can fire them up. If we do end up with an issue, and we may not, because National Grid has been aware of this problem for some considerable number of months. If we do end up with a problem and somebody's got to power down, there are arrangements with some of industry to start or stop their working days at different times to prevent that surge.
Well, it does illustrate, I suppose, the big problems that all countries are facing at this time. Angela Knight, I'm afraid we've run to the end of the programme now, but thank you so much for joining us here on The Briefing, as always. Well, that's it from me today. Coming up next, it's Esther and Phil, so stick around after the weather.
Good morning, I'm Luke Mile with your weather forecast, and it's a cold and a frosty start to your Friday morning. A sharp frost in places, scrapers at the ready because we've got snow and ice to contend with over the next few days. You can see the blues across the map indicating that we've got very cold air in place with the winds coming down from the Arctic, so several degrees below where we should be for this time of year. Now, we've got ice warnings in place across parts of Wales, the southwest of England and many eastern counties of England and Scotland through this morning. Also got a snow and ice warning across Scotland. We could see 2 to 5 centimetres at lower levels, more over the higher ground. But once the sun soon gets to work on that, we will see plenty of it through the day, and those ice warnings tending to fade away through the day, with further showers feeding in to these western coasts exposed to the northwesterly breeze. But it's a cold day, 2 to 5 degrees on the thermometer, and as soon as that sun starts to set, our temperatures will plummet away once again. You can see the blue enveloping the map, a very cold night to come. The risk of further wintry showers affecting some western areas, and continuing to see snow and ice across Scotland throughout. Some dense patches of freezing fog forming by the time we get to Saturday morning as well. That could cause some disruption with our temperatures sub-zero, perhaps as low as -10 over the Scottish snow-covered fields. Now, some of that freezing fog will be very slow to clear, and if not persist throughout the day on Saturday. Where it does so, temperatures will stay below freezing. But in the sunshine, again, we'll see plenty of it. Crisp, sparkling sunshine through the day. Temperatures getting up to 2 to 5 degrees. But once again, we continue to see showers peppering our coastal areas, particularly in the north and the west. As we look ahead through the rest of the weekend and into next week, the cold weather stays with us. That freezing fog could be an issue to contend with, and our temperatures staying just a few degrees above freezing. Bye-bye.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Mark Stein. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
Join me, Lawrence Fox, on GB News. Frank, fun, fearless, and sometimes serious. Much as I love a Friday night punch-up, what I really want is a battle of ideas. I want to look at things differently. I want to hear different voices and engage with your unique experiences. Every Friday at 7 p.m. on GB News.
Hello, I'm Esther McVeigh.
And I'm Philip Davis.
Whether you're watching or listening on TV, online or on radio, we handpick the latest stories, debates and expert opinions for your weekend. So whether that's politics, news or showbiz, we've got it covered.
Join us every Saturday morning at 10 o'clock on GB News. Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes & Co. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debate, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes & Co.
I'm Mark Dolan. Join me at 11 on GB News for Headliners, in which I'll be joined by two of the UK's top comedians discussing tomorrow's papers. If it's an important story, we'll cover it, but we'll have some fun along the way. Headliners, the late night paper review that won't send you to sleep like the others will. 7 nights a week at 11 p.m. on GB News.
Monday to Thursday on GB News, it's Bev Turner Today from 10 a.m. We're going to be here for you, our GB News family, to keep you up to date, but also make you smile.
The guy went from puberty to adultery.
And I can't wait to bring a few of my own opinions. I have no time for cultural totalitarianism. We'll engage in passionate, but always polite debate with your thoughts and opinions.